Check it out, check it out, check it out, check it. Sending love and light to all beings in the cosmos. What's up? It's Baraka Blue, and you're tuned in to Path and Present. This week, we have Michael Pérez, who is a professor of anthropology at the University of Washington, my alma mater in Seattle, Washington. It's a dope school. And his research interests include migration and displacement, ethnicity and nationalism, memory, violence, human rights, Muslim societies, and Islam. He is a Cuban American, and he has a really interesting journey as well. He was in the Nation of Islam, and he he's from Miami, if my memory is not failing me. But he's now, of course, in Seattle, Washington, and someone I've met multiple times. Really sweet, really beautiful brother. And so we talked about all type of stuff that relates to his areas of interest. So I'm going to let you guys listen. Before that, as I said I would in a previous podcast introduction, I wanted to just say thank you to everybody for listening. And I wanted to I'm going to read the top 20 countries as far as the most listeners coming in. Now that we've been doing this podcast for, a year and a half? It's kind of cool to check it out. So the number one is the United States, and then the United Kingdom, number 3, Canada, number 4, Australia. Okay, so we got all Western countries. And then 5th is the UAE. Sorry about that. Should have put that on silent. 5th is the UAE. 6th, Turkey. 7th, Indonesia. 8th, Germany. 9, Saudi Arabia. 10, Egypt. 11, Sweden. 12, Malaysia. 13, Singapore. 14, Pakistan. 15, India. 16, France. 17, Netherlands. 18, South Africa, 19, Spain, and 20, Japan. So that's just the top 20. They list like the whole top 50, but I'm not going to go through those. So if you're listening from a country that's not in the top 20, you got to let your folks know so you can get in the top 20. But it's a beautiful thing to see this spreading and to see people tuning in from all over the world. So please continue to support by word of mouth. That's the number one thing. Just tell your folks, tell your people. Again, if there's anybody that you'd like on the podcast, any topics that you'd like discussed, or any thoughts or comments or reflections or feedback at all, send me an email to connect@barakablue.com, and I'll try to get back to you. And I'd love to hear feedback. And then, of course, you can support on Patreon with an amount that is easy for you monthly, and it's just automatic deduction. $1 is an awesome amount, and any more than that is a bonus. So, yeah, that's patreon.com/path and present to see our page. You can check it out. I think there's certain rewards if you give a certain amount, like T-shirts. I think like $100, and I write a poem about a topic of your choosing. And there's a brother who's given 100, and he asked that I write a poem for his mother. So I wrote a poem about his mother, whose name is Sabira, which means, patience. So I wrote a poem called A Station Called Patience. And I really like it. He really liked it too, and he said his mother liked it. And I think it's going to go in my next book of poetry as well. So it's called A Station Called Patience. Maybe I'll read it one of these podcasts. But anyway, this podcast is with Michael Pérez, and I hope you enjoy. One love. You just came back from Jordan. What was that trip about?
So that trip was, first I started I had a study abroad that I was continuing for the second year. And my connection to Jordan goes all the way back to 2003, actually, which was the first time I went to the occupied Palestinian territories, and I wanted to do my research there as an anthropologist. And so I went in '03, and I went with an organization called the Michigan Peace Team, which did like nonviolence organizing in the occupied territories. And I mean, that's a whole nother sort of discussion what happened there, but I left, and then I went back in 2004 to continue my research, and the Israelis held me for 17 hours and then forced me to leave the country. They didn't let me in.
Where did they hold you?
They held me at Tel Aviv airport.
I've been held there too.
Oh yeah?
Not for 17 hours, but for a few hours.
They put me in a cell with a guy from Kazakhstan who was lovely. We could not communicate a word to one another, but fortunately for him, I wasn't crazy, and for me, he wasn't crazy. So we had we just sat there and watched Israeli television and hung out with no verbal communication. So then I had to go back to the States, and when I went back to the States, then I had, I wasn't sure that I could actually ever do my research in Palestine, which is where I wanted to do it. And that's how I came to Jordan in 2005, was like, well, I can't risk getting funded and then not being able to access my field site. So what's the next place I could do research? And I had a lot of friends in Michigan who were Arab, Palestinian, and they had a lot of connections in Jordan, and so it seemed like that was a logical place to go. Plus, Jordan had sort of been underrepresented in studies and people writing about it. To some extent, it still is. Jordan's this kind of place where it seems like it's always the backdrop for somebody else's story. I'm a little guilty of that because I was looking at the Palestinians, but the Palestinians are kind of our Jordan's story at this point, I would say. But typically Jordan is like just backdrop for the Syrian refugees or for Iraqi refugees, but Jordan itself was sort of neglected. So I thought, well, let me go there, and that's in 2005. I went did Arabic. That's actually where I met the Sheikh Nuh community, and then I went back in all of '06 and all of '07 with my wife, and did my dissertation field work there. And we also worked for Islamica magazine. That's how we got connected to that community. Was the magazine was based there, with Suhail Huda and some of the folks of the magazine.
So, what were some of the questions that you were asking in your field work and in your research about the Palestinian refugees?
So the first time I was doing my research there, I was interested in what Palestinianness means after, we have different generations, so I can't pin it on 48, but 48, 67, or those who were born in Jordan and who are citizens of Jordan. I wanted to know what is the meaning of Palestine? What is the meaning of Palestinianness? Where does the consciousness of being Palestinian come from? What experiences, what stories, what knowledge, etc. So I was really focused on identity or the way people identify. And then the interesting thing was that the year I got there, right after I got there, Hamas won the elections. And that had a big impact. So a lot of Palestinians in the camps were really pro-Hamas because they saw that as like an opportunity to... There was an Islamic element that they were putting forth, but they were also, I think, optimistic that Hamas could change the dynamic a bit and actually help move things forward because these people feel very forgotten and neglected. But this time, I was working at a specific camp. And these are Palestinians who they were in 48, they were displaced to Gaza. And then in 67, were displaced to Jordan. And because they came in 67 from Gaza, they never got citizenship. So they've been stateless for 50 years. And all Palestinians are stateless because there's no Palestinian state. But in Jordan, most Palestinians have citizenship from Jordan. And these people do not. And they haven't for 50 years.
Yeah. And the Palestinians there that have been there for 50 years, born or raised there, they don't consider themselves Jordanian. And the Jordanians don't consider them Jordanian either. Is that true or is that changing?
It's complicated, It is complicated. I mean, I've seen instances in which plenty of Palestinians identify as Palestinian, but also see Jordan as their home because they don't know Palestine and they accept through maybe stories of the older generation or whatever. And I've seen, I remember that one moment was I was in the camp and they were doing like these English classes with the kids. And one of the first statements they teach these kids is, "Where are you from?" You have to learn that, and they learn that in English. And if you walk into a camp, all the kids will go, "What's your name? Where are you from?" Like, this is the two standard questions. And so the teacher's like, "Where are you from?" to teach them English. And the kids say Palestine, but this one girl said Gaza camp, which is the camp she lives in.
Wow.
And the teacher was like, "No, you're from Palestine." And so there are people who put an importance on the identification of Palestinian, but a lot of Palestinians see themselves as Palestinian Jordanian, is the way to put it. I mean, it's the only country they know. It's the only place that they think they'll probably ever be. They don't think they're going to get a chance to go back to Palestine, although they would love it.
Right.
But at the same time, there's enough national politics that says that Palestinians belong elsewhere, and Jordanians feel sort of threatened by the demographics. Right. And so
they don't have citizenship. They're not citizens.
Palestinians are the majority.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because in 1948, when they went to Jordan annexed central Palestine, which is what we call today the West Bank. Mm-hmm. And when it did that, it made them all citizens because it took the territory, and it planned on keeping it, right? But then 1967 happens, and the Israelis occupy it, and the PLO emerges, and then Jordan lets it go. And when Jordan let it go, actually, it took all the citizenship away from those Palestinians that lived in the West Bank. It denationalized them. Mm. So, but those who live in what we call the East Bank of Jordan, the vast majority are citizens of Jordan. So they, for all purposes, have equal citizenship rights, although there's still various realms of discrimination that take place.
So when because I haven't been in one of these refugee camps, but when I think of a refugee camp, I think of like a tent city or something like that. But when you say it's 50 years old, I mean, it has to have some more structure than that. So what is a refugee camp like physically? It's
like an urban slum. In many cases, they are worked right into the city, so you wouldn't know that you're in a camp until you kind of go into it, and then you see the architecture and you see that the structures are different. So, and they vary. You have class differences within the camp. So there are people who have nicer homes for camp, and there are those who live in really rugged conditions of the camp, but really slummy in a way. So like the camp I was at, that's the Gaza camp where these people are stateless, the homes are concrete, but the majority of homes have zinc roofs. So it's just a sheet of zinc on top, held down by bricks and debris. So if you can imagine, in the heat in the summer, there's no insulation, it's just a concrete wall, that's all you have. It's really hot, and in the winter it's freezing. Because the Zinco roof doesn't provide any real seal.
I can't imagine. Like, I was in Jordan in the winter, and I had a relatively nice apartment for there, and that's probably the coldest I've ever been. Like, it's cold. It's way colder inside than outside.
It is,
and no central heating, so I can only imagine what they experience.
Yeah, the winter.
People think of the Middle East. Oh yeah, it's hot. Right?
It's hot. It's a desert. No, it rains and it's freezing in Jordan. It snows. But yeah, so the camps are more like, I would call them urban slums in that sense, because the infrastructure is still kind of shoddy. There's a sense of permanence and temporality overlapping one another. This is one of the things we wanted to do with this photo essay in the camp, is that we know what people think when they think of a refugee camp. We wanted to challenge that a bit to show what happens when refugees become long-term displacements. And 50 years or 60 years of being refugees, things change and people make life ordinary, but there's always something slightly off. And that camp sort of, even in its material structures, it's that permanence and temporality kind of overlapping. They're non-citizens, but they've been there for 50 years. They live in permanent-looking structures, but there are impermanent features to these structures. So we wanted to try that. That was one of the things I was interested in, is how people make life possible and ordinary in conditions of, relative insecurity and poverty.
Yeah, I mean, do you follow the political situation in Israel, Palestine, and the developments and what's going on?
I try to. There's a bit of fatigue that sets in, and I get kind of focused on topic I'm working on, and so I get tunnel vision a bit and sort of focus then just on refugees and what the situation is for them. But yeah, I try to keep up with it. I mean, and I thought, I work for the Islamic Monthly at times, and I interviewed for the magazine Reza Aslan a couple years ago, and he's the one who said to me, he said during that interview that he thought Obama would use the Security Council to finally push Israel at the end of his term. And I didn't disbelieve him or believe him. I just been sure, when I saw what Obama, and I read Kerry's speech, I mean, it was 19 pages when I printed it.
Wow.
I was as impressed as I could be for outgoing U.S. president on Israel. I was.
Right.
So that was a really powerful moment, actually.
Yeah, just an abstinence vote is so much for a U.S. president. Right?
Yes, it is.
Do you think that means something as far as the global community shifting on Israel-Palestine? Or do you think with Trump coming in that it's not going to mean much?
I think it means a lot and it means little. It means a lot because you're right. It does. I think it is part of a shift. And I think what explains Obama's quiet, his how quiet he was prior to this, although he wasn't fully quiet, but he was pretty quiet, especially like during Gaza wars and stuff, was that he was working the Iran deal. And I think he prioritized that. But I think he knows there was an attempt to sort of put an international conference together in France. Governments are some governments and people, as they've always been, are working to really move things. And I think it's shifting dramatically. And I think that Obama not only tapped into that, but did a bold move precisely because what's not going to change, in a sense, is that when Trump comes in, everything looks like he's going to give Israel, all the space to do what it wants to do. And I think it was a very clever move for him to set a precedent that Trump will have to break with coming in the presidency.
Right.
Is Netanyahu going to change this? No, I think everybody knows that the two-state solution is over, but it needed to be claimed one last time, and maybe that's what Obama did. So I don't know how it's not moving towards I think it's already a part apartheid state, but I think where it's going to be recognized as such it's the rest where it's moving.
Yeah, and I mean, you work in a lot of around questions of identity, and just this idea of the Israeli state has this real tension between it's a democratic and Jewish state, right? And that, I think for as an American, it's hard to negotiate that. And I just think in reality, it's hard to negotiate that on paper because, it's very similar to be like, America is a white and democratic state. Like, what does that say for your non-white people that live there? Like, it's not all good. It's kind of rough. And, I think it's a sensitive issue because of the history and what's happened to the Jewish people, and then the state of Israel kind of coming out of that, to a large extent. So, and of course, the presentation is like, attack anyone as anti-Semitic who in any way questions, like, how are you really treating your non-Jewish citizens? You know what I mean? But, yeah, it seems like there's a certain, it's hard for me to know. Like, I always feel like, people are becoming a bit more enlightened, and they're realizing, like, it's not fair. Like, it's not fair to have a state be based on full rights for one people and then another type of people being second-class citizens. And it seems like globally people are waking up to that, and it seems like the BDS is pretty successful. But then on the other hand, I had this feeling that, like, Americans are becoming more open and more loving and more compassionate and more multicultural. And then Trump gets elected. So I'm like, man, I don't know at all what's going on. I feel like I live in a strange bubble that doesn't necessarily represent the broader sphere. So
yeah. Well, I think where the change is taking place is in the Jewish American community. And that's where it's going to matter, I think, more than whether it changes within the American public at large. I mean, Peter Beinart, I think his name is, he's a writer, and I would consider him a liberal Zionist. He believes in the Zionist view that this land belongs to Jews, and he's a two-state solution guy. But after Obama's the move in the UN, he was on TV, and he invoked the word apartheid, and he didn't say it was. He said it's going to move that way if something doesn't happen, and even his whole approach was so different. And I just think that a lot of Jewish Americans are struggling with reconciling their affection and commitment to Israel and what that Israel is that they're committed to, and so I think that's where the real change is going to take place. Unfortunately, though, at the top level, institutionally, those influences that work for the state of Israel's sort of expansionist interest are still there, and that's not going to change quickly. Those who lobby for Israel and want to protect Israel from any criticism while it pursues its Zionist dream, that they're still there, and they're the ADL and other organizations but at the grassroots level, I think I'm optimistic that Jewish Americans are really growing frustrated with this situation, and that's where it's going to matter more than anywhere else, in my assessment. Yeah. And I think that while Netanyahu's terrible, we always have to remember this was a settler colonial state. It was constructed under British colonial occupation, and there was debates about what Zionism was going to mean, and the ones that won were the ones that said it was going to be a state realized exclusively for Jews. There were other perspectives. They didn't win. So I think what's interesting is that I hope it's forcing people to think about the origin story as well, because I don't think Netanyahu is doing anything that's out of sync with, say, what was being done, set in motion in 48. The destruction of homes took place. 480 villages were razed after 1948, and more after 1967. The denial of return, and then the settlement movement starts to boom after the 60s. But the settlements were already underway before 48. Sure. So Netanyahu looks terrible, and he is, but he's the product of something that goes much further into history that I think a lot of people are starting to come to terms with. Hopefully it's not too little too late.
There's been a lot of people talking about the fact that just Israeli society in general is shifting to the right pretty extremely. And you actually see this phenomenon actually happening a lot of places in the world right now. I mean, in Europe and stuff like that. And it seems to me, on the surface of things, that whenever there's instability or just a narrative of fear, whether it's real or perceived, people often gravitate towards figures who are kind of strong men who promise safety. I'll protect you, and I'm going to get the bad guys. I'm going to get the boogeyman. Don't worry. And it's interesting how willing people are to give up their kind of freedoms necessarily for protection. And of course that plays in the Trump phenomenon. It's like the kind of global neoliberal order having a lot of breakdowns in many places, and the middle class dissipating in so many places manifests itself in this rebellion against the kind of neoliberal order, both with Trump and then Brexit and then these rising right-wing parties in Europe as well. So I don't know if it's also that, just the kind of tension growing up in Israel with the tension and the fear of violence that just kind of plays into these right-wing figures or what?
Well, and it could be, I think, on some level, the failure of the left, both in Israel and in the United States. I mean, the so-called left wing of the doves of Israel were expanding settlements and had policies that were not actually achieving the goals that they were setting forth. They did not present a radical alternative to the right, and they had their time. And I think in the United States, maybe maybe the left hasn't done enough to actually, my thinking at this point is that while I always think protest and working outside of the system is an essential, thing to do, how many of us are entering those systems to try to change them? How many of us want to be political and not just push from the outside? And so, I think there's a failure on the left's part to be able to really mobilize politically, and not in an activist way exclusively, but mobilize politically and start to build, say, a different Democratic Party. I mean, I think Bernie spoke to that there's a hunger for something further on the left, but why is this, 70-plus-year-old guy from Vermont having to do that?
Right.
We need younger, more people entering these institutions of power, and always maintain the pressure on the outside as well. And I think that that's kind of a failure on our part, that we're not thinking about how to approach this in the most productive ways. And we have to bite the bullet and be like, Hoshana Shawant, and enter the city council. And yes, you're an institution of power and you're going to face constraints, but enough of, you need people to do that. You need to go in and push it a little further. We can't stay on the outside and protest all the time. And I don't mean to belittle any of the activism that's going on, but I just think that we have to enter politics. If we wanted the Democratic Party to serve us, we have to enter it. We can't beg Hillary Clinton or, and these kinds of figures to do the work for us.
And you're seeing, like, in Hillary's failure, you're seeing this real split exposed, this fissure exposed in the Democratic Party. You have the kind of like Sanders, Ellison, Elizabeth Warren, and then you have the more establishment, centrist, corporate. I mean, in many ways, you have kind of like Occupy Wall Street and Wall Street, which is, it's so silly. Like, Hillary's coalition was so impossible because it was Occupy Wall Street and Wall Street at the same time. You know what I mean? It's just so ridiculous and so absurd, in fact, and really so arrogant that you thought you could put that forth and that anyone would believe it, But how did you, as a Cuban American, get interested in the Middle East and North Africa and Islam?
So that comes from my experience in the Nation of Islam. The first time I heard about Palestine was when Louis Farrakhan did what they called the Friendship Tour back in I think it was in the mid 90s or late 90s, and he went and visited Iraq and Palestine and sat with Yasser Arafat and a bunch of other people. So until that point, as a kid, I never even heard the words Palestine, that I can remember. And that trip, because we were all in the Nation and we were all inspired in a sense, because it was like he was building relationships for us as the community with people abroad, and he would then speak about the Palestinian issue at times, not a lot, but he would. And so that was sort of the first seeds of me having heard about that. But so I when I was Muslim and I was an undergraduate, I went to Morocco to take Arabic for study abroad. And then I came back to the States and graduated. And then I was sort of thinking about what I would do. And I either wanted to go to law school or I wanted to go to anthropology, and I wasn't sure what to do. But long story short, September 11th attacks happened. And at the same time, the Intifada was already in motion. And so all of a sudden, these two things start to come together on the news. And I had been a subscriber to Harper's Magazine at that point for probably a year or two. And I read Chris Hedges' piece, A Gaza Diary, which was just a short diary of him being in Gaza for a little while. And when I read that, I was horrified because I couldn't believe that injustice was happening, especially because there was stuff on the news that was showing, Israel's the victim of terror, and yet I heard nothing, remotely close to what Chris Hedges was describing was happening in Gaza. So that motivated me, and as anything, the more labor you put into something, the more connection you get to it. So I, went and got Edward Said's The Question of Palestine and started to read. I started to work with some of the Muslim students at University of Miami. They were holding like these protests during that period in defense of Palestine. Joined them, and that all mobilized me in a sense to go, well, maybe I can use anthropology as a way to say something about and understand something about what's going on in Palestine. And that's what drove me ultimately in that direction.
So, to backtrack, you mentioned the nation.
Yeah.
So you grew up in Miami?
I did. Yeah.
What was that? How was your path to the nation?
Well, it was primarily through my brother we both listened to hip hop as kids. Mm-hmm. And I think that planted a seed that we weren't aware of at the time, because we're talking about the era of tapes, cassettes, we were listening to cassettes. So, I saw Run DMC play, back in the late 80s. We went to 1989, 1990, we were really deeply in hip hop. And we didn't know anything about Islam. At least we didn't think we knew anything about Islam at the time. But when my brother went to community college, he was interested in hip hop, and he met a few Black American guys who were hip hop artists or aspiring, but they were in the Nation of Islam, and that brought him into it. And then he would nag me about it, and I was on a path. I was doing a lot of drugs, but there was a point at which my drug use was like not just, I want to get wasted. It was like, I don't know if you ever read the books of Don Juan. That's what I was reading at the time. And it was at that time, but I was like, whoa,
Carlos
okay.
Castaneda.
Exactly. So there was some process that was happening already.
Entheogen, let's experiment with consciousness. Yes. Let's go deeper.
Exactly. There was a sense for something deeper. And for the first time. And that was what mattered. And so when my brother's conversations and my reaching that point started to come together is when I finally, he persuaded me. He said, he would nag me to come to the mosque once, just come to the mosque, And I went, and it blew me away. It was a young black guy named Brother Gerald, and we were in a strip mall mosque, very humble. And he just spoke a language that, I'm coming out of a Miami Cuban-American suburban family, but he spoke a language I understood, He spoke about things that I'd never heard in the church or anything I'd heard in any religious context before. And that inspired me, and I went back again, and then we did then little by little, they just start getting more integrated. But we had the benefit that the minister of that mosque was one of the sons of Elijah Muhammad, Brother Rasul Muhammad, and he was raised in Mexico. And his wife at the time was Mexican, and so he had an affinity for the Latinos who came into that mosque. Because even though he was black and American, he spent so much time in Mexico that when he met my brother, and we had, Puerto Rican, a couple Peruvians, then he that was a part of himself that he could never, I think, act, because his audience was a different crowd in that mosque until the Latinos were there. So then it was holistic for him. He could interact with, now he could speak Spanish and English. Right. He could talk about the ghetto, and he could talk about Latin America. And he was happy about that, and we were too. That gave us a sense of we belong, because, just coming with a racial paradigm, you're like, I don't look like that, brother. How am I in the nation?
Right, and so much of the nation's, articulation is racialized. So it's like...
Yeah, so, that was comforting to see this light-skinned guy who's like, I'm a Mexican-American Muslim who's the son of Elijah Muhammad. And that worked for us. And that made us feel much, much, much more home. Yeah.
So you also have done work on Islam in popular culture here in America?
Yeah, I developed this class back in 2012. And I wanted to do something that was creative instead of just teaching intro to Islam. I wanted to, and I also, of course, I wanted for students to think critically about representation. So I thought, let me create this class, and I taught it a few times, and I included that portion of my background. It was I got to go back to Brand Nubian, early Ice Cube, and all this stuff, and play it for the students, and help them see that Islam was already within the culture of hip hop, especially at this time, was prominent, and that's popular culture. That's Islam and Muslims making a very important part of the hip hop history musically. So it was a great opportunity for me. And then I got also to show not just how people represent Muslims, but how Muslims represent Islam and how they, in artistic ways. So I brought Mark Gonzalez to my class. Willow Wilson's come to my class. I had Musa Saeed. I don't know if you know him. He's a director. He did Valley of the Saints, and he's done a couple PBS documentaries. One about the son who inherits the butcher shop in New York, a Muslim butcher shop. And so, he gave a Skype lecture, but it was a great experience. But yeah, I thought that would be a different way of approaching teaching Islam instead of just always, 5 pillars or whatever. I wanted to show the cultural life of Muslims and the ways that some people represent Muslims. Yeah.
So you talk a lot about identity, and I think it's really interesting. I haven't followed it that much, but I came out of kind of a left-leaning activist background, making revolutionary hip hop, very much influenced by the golden age hip hop that you were listening to, and also reflecting on what does it mean to be, person of European descent. Who, also getting that messaging, which is very Afrocentric and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And that was a lot of my early exposure to Islam was through that as well. But question of identity are really interesting to me. And I think now what I see with a lot of young people, there's so much emphasis on identity, and even there's questions about what people call identity politics, even in relation to the Democratic Party, like identity versus principle, and like Obama, like how the Democratic Party, put forth a black man or put forth a woman or put forth whatever, as long as that person isn't challenging, Goldman Sachs. So the way that you can put like a female or a darker hued man, and that people, a lot of like liberal white people in Seattle will feel super good about like, yes, I'm going to vote for Obama. You know what I mean? Like that. But whether it's actually challenging or changing policies, because in many ways Obama might have done things that all these people would be up in arms if George Bush did it. But if Obama does it, it's, you know what I mean? We feel okay. We feel it's, give him a pass or something like that. And then you're a professor, and I haven't followed it that much, but you hear a lot of people talking about like the danger of PC culture and all this stuff, right? And, this like outrage, people have been outraged, and recreational outrage, and gender, and the different levels, even like how many pronouns and what pronoun do you use in this? Like, do you follow all those conversations? Because I feel like there's a lot there, and there's a lot of conversations that are happening in the young and activist circles, and then of course we have Black Lives Matter. We have, all these things are happening. It feels like there's so much around. What boils down to is what is identity, and what does identity mean?
Well, first of all, I think the idea that PC culture, you hear it from people, liberals like Bill Maher, or you hear it from like right-wingers. Mm-hmm. And most of the time what they really mean is they want to talk like a racist and get away with it. Now whether the language of identity has some excesses, sure, I think so. I could start right with the Muslim community. I think that there is a dangerous and flawed idea of an Islam and a West, which is the sad product of the very thing that many Muslims and scholars have spent a lot of time criticizing. And actually feel like a lot of how they identify hinges on this distinction. Whereas I think we should be working for true inclusivity, of course, acknowledging power, but always being, but trying to overcome these limitations, because there are limitations. I mean, where am I? I'm a Cuban American of Spanish descent, Muslim convert through the Nation of Islam. What am I? Where do my loyalties stand? I mean, you can't define my loyalties by virtue of some geographic origin alone, and it shouldn't. And I don't want. So we have to be very careful, I think, especially today, to not essentialize ourselves. I understand that it can do important work, and at times it may be necessary, but we get too comfortable essentializing. I saw it in the Nation of Islam. That was one of my critiques. Is that they wanted to construct a very limited notion of blackness that was at odds with other black authors and other black, intellectuals and cultural producers that were talking about their experiences of blackness. It didn't fit into there. And so, while on one hand I recognize that the Nation was constructing a necessary essentialism in a context of black and white and racial oppression, they couldn't stop there. They stopped there when they shouldn't have. And we can't fall victim to the same thing. So we have to be very careful not to essentialize ourselves, because we have overlapping loyalties and overlapping senses of who we are, and those shift at times. And I'm not trying to throw us into some sort of postmodern, there is no identity, but I just mean that we got to be cautious about how we construct this and how we put ourselves forward. Because I think that we can create more problems than actually we're trying, than solve them. And so, so that's one of the dangers I see. And I see it in, there was this conference I saw not too long ago that was taking place in Spain. It was like post-colonial Muslim Islam, etc., and the West. And I was just thinking, but wait a minute, it's one thing to acknowledge European power and European colonialism, but once we start constructing some sort of essentialized European and whatever, isn't that the same thing? Haven't we been resisting the clash of civilization thesis now for the last decade? And now all of a sudden there's a purely Islamic pedagogy, there's a purely Islam. No, that's not true. Muslims have always been interacting with knowledge and cultures from all over the world, and that's what's given us our beauty. And instead, we're kind of trying to, in a hyper-defensive mode, we're limiting ourselves. And we shouldn't be afraid of that thing we call the West. We should overcome that distinction and work with something more rich and more diverse.
Mm. Yeah. No, I feel like a lot of this stuff is problematized by the fact that a lot of people are speaking past each other, and for some reason, with social media and just with every little controversy or every little debate, it becomes clearer and clearer that a lot of people aren't really trying to hear people on the other side of the conversation. They really don't want to hear them. They come in with a position and they want to maintain that through and through. And so whatever is out of tune with that perspective, they're just going to look past it. And there's something about the internet which I don't know if it's the impersonalness, but it just removes the veil. People don't read the comment section. It's there's just where did that come from? The level of just darkness and real cruelty. But yeah, I feel like a lot of these conversations, and there's this recent thing with Sheikh Hamza Yusuf's comments at RIS, and then, his comments, and then apology, and then people attacking him, and then people defending him, and this and that. And what I felt was lost is if you step back and say, in a traditional society, we all live in a village, right? If somebody said something which was painful or hurtful, or whether they misspoke or whether they really meant what they said, and it hurt a certain segment of the population, then those individuals would have the ability to say, that's not cool, the X, Y, and Z, and then this person would have an ability to respond. And then there would be some, what did you mean by that? Did you mean what you're saying? No, or I didn't, or yes, I did. You see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. And then there's the ability to talk that out, or checks and balances, or other people could come in, or people could, in some way it could be reconciled. Or maybe not. Maybe someone has to get banished from the village or whatever, but there's a way to deal with it. And I feel like now in the social media generation where communities are constituted by individuals that in many cases will never meet each other and will never occupy the same physical space, let alone live in the same village. And then someone says a word which is recorded, someone then types this, someone writes it. And like, I feel like there's this real breakdown of communication, which makes it really hard to actually constitute a community. Because I felt like, you know, the irony of the Sheikh Hamza thing is that when he said what he said, somebody reported he said this, and then people started forming opinions. Without the people forming opinions even actually hearing what he said, it was all hearsay. You know what I mean? And so I was like, I don't have an opinion yet because I don't know what was said. I'm just hearing people say what was said the whole telephone game. So, yeah, those are. But
Facebook is kind of like an awkward silence that people are constantly trying to fill. Mm. You know, it's like this thing that in order for it to be anything, you got to talk, and you got to talk. And so once you're connected to it, you're just constantly filling in that space. And it's not, you know, this isn't a sort of polemic on Facebook, but it's more about the ways we behave with this thing. But then it needs voice constantly. And it's that kind of medium is probably not the best for careful reflection and speculation and thinking through this stuff critically. So it just becomes the next thing to talk about, and people just constantly filling it in. And I think that's probably, people can be responsible, I'm sure, and critical and reflective with Facebook, but I think that it's too many of us are trying to fill that awkward silence all the time. And so Sheikh Hamza Yusuf becomes something to fill that silence until the next thing comes up to fill it, and just keep pouring and pouring and pouring. And like you say, there's a difference between you and I talking here than us throwing a comment on Facebook. It's not conducive, I think, towards the most productive ways of communicating with one another.
Yeah.
And it's got some great potential, but I just think of it as people need to fill an awkward silence. Like once it's there, they just got to talk.
Right.
And that's not always a good thing.
So what are you looking at now? Or what questions are you interested in, or what research? I know you mentioned Islam in Latin America, and
those are some longer term goals. I mean, we're thinking, like I told you, I'm talking to Ali Mian. We've been thinking for now a year about how to really move on some discussions on gender and sexuality. Where, we wrote these pieces for the blog, and I was using it as an opportunity to finally hear myself articulate my thoughts on the LGBTQ community in Islam, which is something that's too easily not talked about. And it's, for in some cases, I think for good reasons, I felt personally like I wasn't prepared to say certain things, but I thought that I wanted an opportunity to start to give voice to that, because when that young woman was up there that day at the vigil, and she said, I'm queer and I'm Muslim, I had to ask myself, do we have a space for that person in our mosque? What kind of a space is it? Do we even think that this person deserves a space? Why or why not? And these are questions that are very easy to kind of to ignore. And I think Ali and I are really thinking about these things. And we're also thinking about things like masculinity. You look at the violence in parts of where the world where Muslims live, and you have to see that men are very much involved in this stuff. So we need to start asking questions about the links between violence and manliness and these sorts of things, and ask ourselves what kind of ethics can Islam provide for thinking about our lives as sexual beings, which we are, and gendered beings, which we are, and all these other things. And so that's something that we were really hoping to work towards. And I think that he and I are a good pair because he's got a bit more of the, I think, textual historical context in his work, and I've got a bit more of the kind of diversity of ethnography and the different ways that societies have constructed gender and sexuality. And so I think bringing those together would be a nice project. So that's something we'd really like to work on, and then move in towards seeing how Islam sort of emerges in Islam, in Latin America, and how it's indigenized, and what does it mean to be a Cuban Muslim, and what's influencing that, what's limiting it, which, this sort of thing. So, and that's of course very personal to me, because I always struggle with my own my own sense of being Muslim and these other things that I identify myself as. So I'm really fascinated to see how other Cubans are working this out, and what I can learn from them, and what maybe they can learn from me and others here.
Yeah, I think it can be complicated by the fact that, if you think about in the pre-modern world, sure, there was always power, and there's, but, in the absence of mass communication, and when Islam is spreading in a lot of places by trade, there's time and distance enough to develop a lot of indigenous Islams in every locality. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the most beautiful things. I mean, traveling throughout the majority Muslim world, you see that in Senegal, in Indonesia, in Turkey, in Cairo.
It's a great feeling to arrive in this place and see that the mosques are built differently. Yeah. That the clothing is different, and not, what would it mean if we think that all Muslims have to wear the same thing? Yeah. And, I just can't, that to me seems like a poverty of the imagination.
For sure.
We should be thinking in broader terms.
But I think what I was getting at is that because we live in this hyper-connected world, it feels like it can, on some level, stifle the space that allows that. You know what I mean? Because, and then, who's the most powerful? Who has the most oil money? Who has the most influence? Who can, go into these quote-unquote impoverished communities and build mosques and train thinkers and promote certain ideas and sideline other ideas? It kind of can remove the power of that indigenous thing to develop. You know what I mean? The local. And that's what I see as having happened in a lot of the Muslim world. I was blessed to go to Cuba a month ago, and the vast majority of the Muslims that I met there are Cubans, converts, and it was so beautiful to see. I mean, they had a mosque that was built by Saudis, maybe the Turks gave some, I can't remember, but you really get the feeling that there was this very indigenous Cuban Islam, and that people had come to it as seekers, and there was this very camaraderie that they were really because there's such a small group in this broader thing, and then Cubans in general feeling very cut off from the rest of the world. You know what I mean? There was this real sense of communality that you kind of almost hear about only when you're reading about the Sahaba or something like that. So I really felt that there, and it felt really powerful and really beautiful. So, but yeah, I would love, we definitely, inshallah, I can connect you with the people that I met there, because there are some people that are trying to connect with that community there. And absolutely. I think that's an important, especially as America becomes more and more Latino. All right, you go to the southern states, it's already there, And I think this ties in with the whole Trump phenomenon, but somebody said that a few years ago was the first year that the majority of children entering first grade in American public schools are non-white. And that's never going to be reversed. From now on, every year, a smaller percentage are going to be white. You know what I mean? So it's just part of the shifting demographic. So I think those connections, between the, Latinos and...
But it is worrisome that some influences might, and of course I'm making clear I have stakes here, but this, my position is that there is a concern that certain countries have Islam as part of their foreign policy. Totally. And are able to promote and produce an Islam that's really not conducive to the kinds of communities that we've seen other Muslims have. So it is worrisome, and I think that unfortunately, there's a great appeal to some of the ways that this kind of, I hate to call it Salafism because it sort of maybe perverts the word a bit, and I don't know that the word always had that meaning, but this kind of simplification of Islam, that really ignores the legacy of 1,400 years of cultural and intellectual work that Muslims have put into, and practical work into building their communities, that we have this sort of way of thinking about Islam that is so black and white and so easily distributed. It is worrisome. When I was in Cuba, there was a guy that one of the Cuban Muslims was telling me, said he's only a Muslim because he's getting money from this embassy. And the idea was that there were the Iranian and Turkish embassies, this guy said, were vying for influence over those Cubans who were becoming Muslims. And then that may be non-political or it may be, I don't know, but like those are things to worry about. And I know that the Cubans that I met when I was there had very little resources in Spanish. So there's a kind of race here in the sense that, well, what if some of the Saudi clerics start translating their work real quickly into Spanish, and this is what builds that community. Now they have every right to build the community they want, but they should have more options. I would hope,
sure.
I would hate to see that kind of effect happen. I don't see it as productive.
Well, that's what's up, man. Hopefully we can go to Cuba together sometime.
Inshallah.
Okay, it's good talking to you, man.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
Appreciate it. Thank you for listening to Path and Present Podcast. If you want to support the podcast, you can do so in a few ways. One is word of mouth. People hear about the podcast mostly from people like you who listen and like it and say, I know someone who would connect with this, or who would feel this, or who would enjoy this subject matter. So continue to share with your family and friends. Secondly, you can subscribe, rate, and comment on the iTunes page of Path and Present. Subscribing means that the podcast each episode will come directly to you when we release it. And rating and commenting means that it will grow and come up in the iTunes rankings, which will allow it to be available and seen by more people. And then lastly, you can support financially on Patreon. Patreon is a site which allows people to give a small amount monthly to support art or any type of content. And we have a Path and Present page on Patreon. The link is on our SoundCloud page, SoundCloud/Path and Present. And you'll find the Patreon link there. And yeah, you can support there. And we're greatly appreciative of it. I guess lastly, keep us in your prayers, your positive thoughts, and your moments of remembrance. And thank you for tuning in and being part of the global Path and Present family. One love.